The content in this video is based on factual, real-life events and public records. All opinions expressed are for educational and documentary purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised, as some scenes may depict sensitive content. This video is intended for informative purposes and complies with YouTube's guidelines. Inside America's prison system, the truth rarely walks out the front gate. For decades, institutions like Rikers Island, Angola, and Parchment have been investigated for brutality, fabricated reports, and medical neglect that cost inmates their lives. But behind every scandal sits someone whose job is to protect the system, not the prisoners. This documentary follows the leaked findings from a facility where a warden orchestrated one of the biggest cover-ups in modern corrections. What was hidden, and who risked everything to expose it, reveals how deep corruption can run when no one is watching. This is the warden's biggest cover-up, leaked reports from inside the walls. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content. The first signs. The earliest warnings didn't come from whistleblowers or leaked reports. They came from patterns, small inconsistencies that investigators typically catch only after years of misconduct. At Northpoint Correctional Facility, the warden had built a reputation as a strict operator who ran a tight ship, the kind of figurehead departments often praise for reducing incidents on paper. But the first problem was exactly that. The numbers looked too clean. Use of force reports were nearly non-existent for a prison that held over 1,000 inmates, many affiliated with major street gangs. Other facilities of the same size reported double or triple the number of violent encounters. Yet Northpoint's logs appeared almost artificially calm. That calm didn't match the rumors reaching civil rights attorneys or the quiet complaints that trickled from family members who received calls from inmates, describing beatings and retaliation. The first documented incident that raised outside suspicion involved an inmate named Deshaun Miller, who entered the facility with a history of asthma and hypertension. According to the official report, Miller suffered a medical episode in his cell and was found unresponsive by officers during routine checks. But interviews with men housed in the same unit told a different story. They claimed Miller had been pepper sprayed hours earlier after refusing to stand during count. They said he begged for medical help, but was ignored until it was too late. None of this appeared in the warden's official logs. The medical examiner's findings were vague. Pepper spray was never mentioned. The prison insisted that procedures were followed. And with no internal contradiction, the report stood. The first sign of a cover-up was buried under paperwork. Months later, a second suspicious case appeared, this time involving an older inmate with diabetes. His insulin doses were marked as delivered on schedule, yet medication logs conflicted with what nursing staff remembered. When questioned informally, one nurse suggested that officers sometimes changed records after the fact to keep the warden happy. She didn't file anything formally. Speaking up inside that facility meant risking your job or worse. What tied these incidents together was the same pattern investigators would later uncover at Rikers Island and Parchment: selective documentation. Reports that made staff look good were written with precision. Reports that suggested wrongdoing were short, vague, or missing altogether. Inside the prison, inmates understood the message. If you got hurt, it was going to be written up the way the warden wanted it written. Men who asked for medical care were labeled troublemakers. Cameras somehow failed to capture key moments. Officers described violent inmates falling or slipping. No one fought the narrative. The warden made sure of it. He held long-standing control over the internal affairs liaison assigned to the facility. Any complaint triggered an informal review that rarely escalated. Officers who challenged the system were removed from desirable posts. Those who followed orders were rewarded with overtime, early promotions, or shift preferences. The message was simple: loyalty mattered more than truth. The turning point came when a rookie officer, assigned to the segregation unit, witnessed something that didn't align with the clean numbers the warden proudly reported. He saw a restrained inmate dragged across the floor by two officers after an altercation. The inmate, covered in tattoos, gang-affiliated and known for confrontations, was left bleeding near the showers. Later, the official report mentioned only a verbal dispute. No injuries. No use of force. The rookie noticed the lie instantly. He brought it up quietly to his supervisor. Within a week, he was reassigned to the graveyard shift in an understaffed wing known for inmate assaults. The message was clear: keep quiet or get buried in the schedule until you quit. But the rookie didn't quit. He started keeping his own notes, dates, times, names, discrepancies. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would get him caught. Just enough to track the reality behind the warden's numbers. His notes matched the claims inmates had been making for years. Beatings not logged, medical refusals falsified, and incidents rewritten to place blame on prisoners even when officers initiated the violence. This wasn't incompetence. It was orchestration. By year's end, the warden presented his annual report to the department. Reduced violence, improved compliance, and a decline in medical emergencies. The data portrayed Northpoint as a model institution. But outside the walls, public defenders noticed the opposite. Their clients described a place where fear controlled everything. Fear of officers, fear of retaliation, and fear of speaking up. The rookie knew someone needed to see the truth, but leaking information inside a prison was dangerous. Phones were monitored. Emails were logged. A single misstep could destroy his career. Still, the more he witnessed, the more he realized the warden's operation was unsustainable. Every falsified report created another crack in the system. Then one night, an inmate in segregation attempted suicide after days of requesting mental health treatment. Officers insisted he had been monitored properly, but the rookie had seen the opposite. The inmate had been ignored for hours. When the warden demanded the rookie sign a statement confirming consistent wellness checks, he refused. That refusal was the first real break in the cover-up, and the warden felt it. Whistleblowers and leaks. Inside Northpoint, silence was the currency of survival. But when a system is built entirely on deception, the smallest spark of truth can ignite a cascade of revelations. By the time the rookie officer had begun documenting discrepancies in use of force reports and medical logs, he realized he couldn't act alone. There were other observers inside the prison who had seen patterns of abuse for years: correctional staff, medical personnel, and even a handful of inmates who were willing to risk punishment to expose what was happening. The first step was finding allies. Quietly, he began to identify colleagues who shared his unease. Among them was an experienced nurse, Cynthia Ramirez, who had worked at Northpoint for over a decade. She had watched inmates die from neglected chronic illnesses and witnessed officers falsify medication logs, often under the warden's direct orders. Ramirez had long considered reporting the misconduct to the state inspector, but fear of retaliation kept her silent. The officer approached her cautiously, showing her his notes, and she confirmed almost everything he had documented. Together, they began connecting cases, tracing patterns of abuse, and compiling a preliminary dossier that captured the scope of the misconduct. The next challenge was the inmates. These were men who understood the prison's invisible hierarchy, and some carried visible marks of that world: gang affiliations and tattoos that told stories of survival and violence. Despite the danger, a few of them were willing to contribute their experiences anonymously. They described beatings, denial of medication, and solitary confinement used as punishment for minor infractions. These testimonies were difficult to verify individually, but when cross-referenced with the rookie's notes and Ramirez's records, a disturbing pattern emerged. Nearly every significant incident had been altered or omitted from the official reports. The warden, now in his 8th year at Northpoint, maintained tight control over information. All internal communications were routed through his office, and investigations conducted by outside authorities were carefully filtered through his staff. Yet, cracks in the system began to appear. The more the whistleblowers documented, the harder it became to maintain a coherent lie. Small errors in the official logs, incorrect dates, mismatched names, and inconsistent officer statements offered evidence that could not be fully erased. Each discrepancy was a thread in the unraveling fabric of the warden's carefully constructed image. Anonymity was critical. The team relied on secure methods to protect their identities. The officer and nurse used encrypted emails to share files. Inmates relied on handwritten notes smuggled through legal channels, hidden within envelopes marked as attorney correspondence. The team also collected photographs and internal documents, providing visual proof of incidents the warden's reports claimed never happened. These included bruises, damaged cells, and medical charts altered to cover negligence. In all cases, the visual evidence was documented in ways that preserved anonymity. Silhouettes, shadows, and blurred faces ensured no one could be identified publicly while still conveying the harsh reality of the prison environment. By the end of the first year of covert documentation, the team had amassed a dossier large enough to demand external scrutiny. It included more than 50 verified incidents where abuse or neglect had been systematically concealed. They approached state investigators with the evidence, but initial requests for review were met with skepticism. The warden's reputation for efficiency and order had created a protective shield. To many outsiders, the official numbers painted a picture of a model correctional facility. The investigators were instructed to proceed with caution, ensuring nothing could be published until every allegation was verified independently, a process that would take months. During this period, leaks began to surface in small, controlled ways. Internal memos accidentally circulated beyond the warden's office, hinting at discrepancies in use of force reports. Legal filings from inmates' lawyers, initially dismissed as isolated complaints, began to reveal a pattern when compiled and compared. Journalists picked up on these anomalies, but without corroboration, they struggled to build a cohesive story. The whistleblowers understood that only a coordinated effort, combining internal records, inmate testimonies, and independent reporting, would break the warden's hold over the narrative. One pivotal breakthrough came when a former officer, recently transferred to another facility, agreed to provide detailed testimony. He confirmed that the warden had personally instructed staff to manipulate incident reports and downplay injuries, a direct violation of state policy. The account described a chilling culture of fear. Officers who resisted were quietly reassigned. Promotions and bonuses were used to reward compliance, and threats, subtle but unmistakable, ensured silence. His testimony provided investigators with an inside look at the command hierarchy and confirmed suspicions that the cover-up was not isolated but systemic. As the whistleblowers prepared to formally present their evidence, tension inside Northpoint intensified. Staff and inmates sensed that a shift was imminent. Officers became wary, their behavior increasingly cautious. Inmates, already living under strict control, began sharing rumors and subtle warnings with one another. Even minor incidents drew attention from higher-ups, who sought to control the narrative and anticipate the next leak. The warden, aware of the growing unrest, redoubled efforts to maintain his facade of order, tightening internal audits and restricting access to sensitive areas. Despite these efforts, the evidence could no longer be contained. The combination of internal documentation, inmate accounts, and outside verification created a compelling case that demanded accountability. When investigators finally conducted an unannounced audit, they found discrepancies in over 70% of incident reports reviewed, alongside corroborating medical charts showing neglect, altered medications, and repeated use of solitary confinement in violation of policy. The warden's narrative had finally collapsed under the weight of concrete, documented truth. What became clear through this process was that the system itself enabled abuse. Loyalty to a figurehead took precedence over human safety. Processes designed to ensure accountability, audits, reporting mechanisms, oversight boards, were manipulated to protect authority rather than serve justice. The whistleblower's courage exposed not just one warden's misdeeds, but a structural failure with consequences that echoed through the lives of every inmate housed within the facility. Inmates who had once been invisible were finally heard. The warden, forced to defend himself against mounting evidence, could no longer maintain the image of a model facility. His career, built on control and concealment, began to unravel. In the end, the chapter of whistleblowers and leaks revealed a crucial truth. Corruption cannot survive in the light forever. Even within walls designed to hide brutality and silence the vulnerable, determined observers armed with evidence can force accountability. At Northpoint, what began as quiet notes in the hands of a cautious officer evolved into a full exposé, setting the stage for justice and systemic reform. The investigation expands. By the time state investigators received the whistleblower's dossier, the Northpoint scandal had already begun to seep into public consciousness. Small leaks in internal memos, combined with court filings and the quiet persistence of journalists, had created a faint but undeniable trail. What began as isolated allegations of falsified reports and medical neglect was now emerging as evidence of systemic abuse, and one warden at the center of it all. The investigative team faced a daunting challenge: how to untangle years of carefully manipulated documentation while maintaining the safety of whistleblowers and witnesses. Northpoint's records were meticulous in appearance, but deep discrepancies had been deliberately inserted to conceal misconduct. Officers' logs, medical charts, and use of force reports were all part of a carefully orchestrated illusion of order. The warden's fingerprints were everywhere: subtle edits to incident reports, missing video footage, and reassignments of staff who might have objected to the falsified records. Investigators began by conducting interviews with staff who had recently left the facility. Many were hesitant at first, wary of retaliation or defamation lawsuits. Yet as they were presented with corroborating evidence from multiple sources, their willingness to speak grew. Stories emerged of officers who had witnessed assaults on inmates, but were instructed to describe them as routine corrections or accidental falls. Nurses recounted being pressured to falsify medical logs or document medications that had never been delivered. Even veteran guards, who had long followed the warden's directives without question, admitted they had begun to suspect the extent of the deception. A pivotal part of the investigation involved inmate interviews. Here, the challenge was balancing transparency with protection. Many inmates feared retaliation, knowing that speaking out could result in solitary confinement, loss of privileges, or physical harm. Investigators adapted their methods, conducting interviews with blurred faces and back-of-the-head shots to protect identities. Their accounts revealed a consistent pattern: gang-affiliated inmates, easily identifiable by tattoos marking their affiliations, were frequently targeted for punitive actions disguised as disciplinary measures. Officers would provoke minor conflicts, then cite the resulting incidents in official reports to justify punishments that included extended isolation or medical neglect. The investigation also uncovered deliberate obfuscation of video surveillance. Cameras in key areas had malfunctions during critical incidents, often coinciding with reported assaults. Investigators found evidence that footage had been edited or overwritten, making it difficult to track what really happened in the facility. These findings pointed to a warden who not only tolerated misconduct, but actively manipulated evidence to protect staff and maintain the appearance of a compliant, orderly prison. Outside scrutiny intensified as the investigation expanded. State inspectors demanded access to all internal records, medical files, and officer logs. Initially, access was restricted under the guise of operational security, but mounting pressure forced the warden to comply. Investigators began cross-referencing incident reports with medical records, identifying glaring contradictions. In one case, an inmate listed as receiving routine checks during a medical emergency had actually gone hours without care. Another case involved a gang-affiliated inmate who had been subjected to excessive force, then recorded as compliant and cooperative in official logs. Patterns were clear. The warden had orchestrated a system where the truth was subordinate to appearances. As the scope of the investigation widened, so did the network of whistleblowers. Former staff members who had been reassigned or forced out began to come forward, providing additional documentation and corroborating testimonies. Legal teams representing inmates worked closely with investigators to ensure that all evidence of abuse was recorded, cross-verified, and preserved for potential disciplinary action. Even journalists, carefully fact-checking their reports, played a role by keeping public attention on the scandal, making it harder for administrators to quietly suppress the findings. The investigation also highlighted systemic failures beyond individual misconduct. Policies intended to protect inmates, such as regular audits, oversight by external agencies, and reporting channels, had been manipulated to serve the warden's agenda. Internal audits were frequently delayed, altered, or conducted superficially, creating a false sense of compliance. Investigators discovered that key internal affairs staff were effectively enforcers of the warden's will, discouraging complaints and selectively investigating only those incidents that aligned with the official narrative. One particularly revealing moment occurred when investigators reviewed years of use-of-force reports alongside employee rosters and shift schedules. They found that certain officers repeatedly appeared in reports that had been corrected or suppressed. Cross-referencing these with incident dates and witness statements revealed an alarming concentration of unreported abuse. Cases in which injuries, medical neglect, or excessive force were either underreported or entirely fabricated. This mapping of incidents against personnel painted a detailed picture of a culture of compliance enforced by fear. Media interest surged as fragments of the investigation reached the public. News outlets ran pieces highlighting discrepancies in Northpoint's reports, quoting anonymous sources and whistleblowers. The warden attempted to maintain a public image of professionalism, emphasizing reductions in incidents and improved operational efficiency, but investigators knew these claims were largely fabricated. The weight of the evidence was increasingly difficult to deny. By the end of the first investigative year, state authorities had compiled a dossier exceeding several thousand pages. This included internal communications, medical charts, incident reports, witness statements, and visual documentation of abuse, both recent and historical. The findings were clear. Northpoint was a facility where systemic abuse had been hidden behind manipulated reports, carefully maintained appearances, and a culture of fear. The warden had created a cover-up so complete that only coordinated whistleblowing and independent investigation could expose the truth. The stage was set for public disclosure, legal consequences, and administrative reforms. The warden, once untouchable within the facility, faced unprecedented scrutiny. Officers who had maintained loyalty through complicity found themselves under review, and the inmates, many gang-affiliated and previously invisible to the system, finally had their experiences documented and recognized. What began as quiet notes in the hands of a single rookie officer had evolved into an extensive investigation capable of reshaping the narrative of one of America's most notorious correctional facilities. The fallout. Once the investigation into Northpoint Correctional Facility began producing tangible evidence, the impact rippled through the prison system. What had started as a quiet, carefully documented effort by a small group of whistleblowers evolved into a cascade of administrative and public consequences. The warden's carefully maintained reputation as a model administrator began to unravel, and the reverberations affected not only him but the staff, inmates, and oversight bodies connected to the facility. The first wave of fallout was internal. Officers who had previously been loyal because of fear or incentives now faced intense scrutiny. Routine shifts became tense, with staff acutely aware that investigators were reviewing past actions and incident reports. Some officers attempted to distance themselves from the warden's directives, rewriting logs or claiming they had followed procedure without influence. Others, particularly those who had benefited from preferential treatment under the warden, sought legal counsel to protect themselves against potential disciplinary action or criminal charges. Within the facility, inmates sensed the change. Men who had previously been isolated or intimidated by officers began speaking more freely, at least cautiously, to investigators and legal representatives. Gang-affiliated inmates, identifiable by their tattoos, provided first-hand accounts of beatings, neglect, and harassment. While fear of retaliation remained, the warden's diminishing control created cracks in the system, giving inmates a fragile sense of agency for the first time in years. Media coverage amplified the impact. National outlets picked up on leaked documents and investigative findings, framing Northpoint as emblematic of systemic corruption in U.S. prisons. Journalists highlighted patterns consistent with other facilities like Rikers Island, Angola, and Parchman, drawing attention to how leadership could manipulate records and suppress truth to protect authority rather than ensure inmate safety. The warden, once shielded by a reputation for efficiency and order, became a focal point of public outrage. The warden's response was predictable. In public statements, he emphasized the facility's commitment to safety and improvements in incident management. Internally, he attempted to maintain morale and control by holding meetings with officers and staff, reiterating loyalty as a key value. Yet these efforts were increasingly hollow. Investigators were now reviewing years of records, cross-referencing medical logs, and interviewing former employees. Any attempt to manipulate reports or intimidate staff was met with warnings from legal authorities, leaving the warden increasingly isolated. Administrative consequences quickly followed. State correctional authorities issued temporary suspensions for select officers implicated in falsified reports. Medical staff were reassigned or placed under supervision. The Internal Affairs Department underwent a complete overhaul, with independent inspectors replacing personnel who had long been accused of complicity in suppressing complaints. These changes, while necessary, highlighted the depth of the cover-up and the structural vulnerabilities in Northpoint's chain of command. Meanwhile, whistleblowers, though still anonymous to the public, were recognized privately for their courage. The rookie officer and nurse who first documented the abuses received protection and continued guidance from legal representatives and investigators. Their meticulous record-keeping became central to disciplinary hearings and subsequent reforms. The success of their work also inspired similar efforts in other facilities, encouraging staff and inmates elsewhere to step forward when patterns of abuse were evident. The legal fallout for the warden was significant. Administrative hearings scrutinized his role in instructing staff to falsify records, manipulate incident reports, and suppress complaints. State prosecutors considered criminal charges related to neglect, abuse, and obstruction of justice. While formal indictments were still pending, the weight of evidence left little room for defense. The warden's career, once lauded in correctional circles, teetered on collapse. At the same time, the fallout extended to policy and oversight. State and federal correctional agencies began re-evaluating reporting protocols, internal audit procedures, and protections for whistleblowers. Audits of other facilities were initiated to determine whether similar patterns of abuse and cover-ups existed elsewhere. Northpoint became a case study, demonstrating how unchecked authority, combined with fear and loyalty-based enforcement, could allow systemic abuse to continue undetected for years. The human toll was stark. Many inmates suffered lasting physical and psychological effects due to neglect, violence, and isolation. Mental health professionals involved in the case noted an increase in post-traumatic stress symptoms among formerly silenced inmates. Families who had long suspected wrongdoing were finally able to confirm their fears, but the confirmation offered little solace for the years of suffering endured. In some respects, the fallout also created hope. Policies began to shift, with new reporting channels and protections for staff and inmates. Investigative journalists and oversight agencies now had a blueprint for identifying similar abuses elsewhere. The bravery of those who risked career, safety, and personal security to expose the truth became a catalyst for reform. Even the public began to recognize that prison safety and accountability required vigilance, transparency, and the courage to question authority. By the end of this phase, Northpoint Correctional Facility was no longer just a location. It had become a symbol, a cautionary tale of how absolute authority, unchecked by oversight, could lead to systemic abuse. Yet it was also a testament to the power of documentation, persistence, and collective courage. One rookie officer, one nurse, and a handful of inmates had ignited a chain reaction that exposed years of deception. Their actions forced accountability in a system designed to obscure it. The fallout would continue for years. Trials, internal reviews, and policy reforms were only the beginning. Northpoint scandal became a reference point in discussions about prison reform across the country. The warden's downfall illustrated that corruption can thrive under silence. But when truth is documented and revealed, even the most entrenched systems can be forced to answer. Aftermath and reform. The exposure of Northpoint Correctional Facility's cover-up marked the beginning of a new chapter, not just for the prison itself, but for the broader conversation about accountability, oversight, and human rights within the U.S. prison system. While the initial fallout dismantled the warden's authority and exposed systemic abuse, the long-term effects reshaped policies, personnel accountability, and the culture inside correctional institutions. Investigators and policymakers quickly recognized that uncovering the truth was only the first step. Lasting reform required structural changes to prevent abuses from recurring. Northpoint underwent a comprehensive audit, examining every aspect of operations, from use of force protocols to medical care, staff promotions, internal reporting, and inmate grievances. New systems were implemented to ensure that incident reports were verified by independent observers rather than officers under direct supervision of potentially compromised management. One of the most critical reforms was the creation of robust whistleblower protections. Staff members were now able to report misconduct without fear of reassignment or retaliation, and procedures were implemented to verify and document all allegations. For inmates, this meant clearer channels for complaints, greater oversight by external agencies, and mandatory reporting on medical care, safety checks, and use of force incidents. These changes aimed to restore trust in a system that had long relied on fear and silence. The warden faced significant legal and professional consequences. Administrative hearings scrutinized his actions, with disciplinary measures including suspension and revocation of certain privileges. While some aspects of potential criminal charges were still under review, his career in corrections was effectively over. The investigation also prompted similar reviews at other facilities with histories of complaints, showing how one exposed cover-up could trigger systemic reform across multiple institutions. The human element remained central to the story. Inmates who had suffered under the warden's policies now had their experiences formally documented and recognized. Gang-affiliated prisoners, once invisible within the system, were included in reports as eyewitnesses and victims, ensuring that their stories were considered in reform discussions. Former staff who had risked careers to reveal the truth were acknowledged privately, setting a precedent for courage and ethical responsibility in an environment where silence had been standard. Beyond Northpoint, the scandal became a catalyst for broader public awareness. Media coverage, investigative documentaries, and news reports highlighted the dangers of unchecked authority in prisons. Advocacy groups used the case as an example of why transparency and independent oversight are essential. Discussions in policy circles emphasized the need for regular audits, independent reporting channels, and accountability measures that could prevent manipulation of incident records. The Northpoint case demonstrated that even a deeply entrenched system of control could be challenged when evidence, courage, and persistence converged. Reform, however, was not just administrative, it was cultural. Staff and inmates alike began to navigate a new landscape in which accountability mattered more than loyalty to a single authority figure. Training programs emphasized ethical responsibility, conflict resolution, and transparency. Officers learned that documenting incidents truthfully was no longer optional, and medical staff were empowered to report neglect without fear. For inmates, it meant recognition that their voices mattered and that patterns of abuse could be challenged. Yet the story was not without lingering shadows. Years of abuse could not be erased overnight. The trauma endured by inmates left lasting psychological and physical scars. Families who had long feared for their loved ones had to confront the consequences of years of neglect. The whistleblowers, though protected, carried the burden of knowing how many lives were affected before reforms took root. The warden's deception left a permanent mark, a reminder of the consequences when power goes unchecked. Ultimately, the Northpoint saga became a case study in systemic failure and reform. It illustrated how authority could be misused, how fear could suppress truth, and how courage, quiet, persistent, and meticulous, could break through even the most carefully maintained cover-ups. The warden's downfall was not simply a personal failure. It was an opportunity to examine a system that had allowed corruption to flourish. The exposure prompted policy reform, cultural shifts, and an ongoing dialogue about accountability in prisons nationwide. The lessons extended beyond Northpoint. They served as a warning that oversight cannot be superficial, that internal checks must be independent, and that those who witness wrongdoing must have safe avenues to report it. Most importantly, it showed that systemic abuse, no matter how deeply embedded, can be challenged and corrected when evidence and courage intersect. The story of Northpoint Correctional Facility reminds us that silence can protect power, but truth has a way of finding its voice. One warden's cover-up revealed the depth of systemic failure, but also showed the strength of those who refused to stay silent. From whistleblowers documenting abuse to inmates sharing their experiences, courage and persistence forced accountability. Northpoint is now a cautionary tale, a symbol of both the dangers of unchecked authority and the transformative power of truth. In the shadows of prison walls, justice may move slowly, but when documented, verified, and exposed, it can move inexorably forward.